I was the one paying my family's bills for years, but when I overheard them laughing about using me as their ATM, I stayed silent. Until the rent was due. I never imagined that after years of grinding away at life, I'd wake up one night to the realization that my family had been using me like a crutch, draining every last ounce of my hard-earned money without a shred of gratitude. My name is Lydia, I'm 29, and for too long, I'd tolerated their constant demands. I was the dependable one, the sister, the daughter, the unspoken provider, all while feeling increasingly worn down and isolated. I had spent countless nights on the road after brutal shifts at the diner, my muscles screaming from exhaustion and my mind numb from stress. It was during one of those nights, when the neon lights blurred past in a haze of fatigue, that I began to suspect something was deeply wrong. My phone buzzed unexpectedly. A call that arrived in the quiet hours around midnight. I answered with the drowsy hope of a familiar voice, but the sound on the line was anything but comforting. The voice on the other end was my mother, Judith, aged 55, whose tone was laced with false sweetness. "Lydia, dear," she said, her voice tremulous yet calculated, "we need to talk." I frowned. It wasn't every night that Mom called me at such an odd hour. There was a tension I couldn't quite place. I listened as she spoke in a measured cadence about mundane things. The rising bills, the extra charges, and always with that underlying expectation that I'd somehow fix everything with my money. I was barely awake when I realized that behind her gentle facade lurked the true nature of our relationship. I recalled past evenings when my sister Fiona, who was 31 and always seemed to have an air of superiority, would casually drop hints about my sacrificial role in the family's finances. And my brother David, 27, with his offhand remarks about how things just wouldn't work without Lydia's help, echoed the same sentiment. I'd always brushed them off as harmless banter, but as I sat there, cradling the phone in trembling hands, a chill ran through me. That night, the air in my cramped apartment felt heavier than usual. I was overwhelmed by a growing sense of vulnerability. A mixture of physical exhaustion and the dawning realization that I was taken for granted. The familiar ache in my bones wasn't just from my shift. It was the weight of years of unreciprocated sacrifice. And now, as I listened to my mother's carefully measured words, I wondered if I had become nothing more than a walking ATM, a repository for their entitlement and greed. I ended the call with a quiet, "Okay, Mom," my voice betraying none of the inner turmoil churning inside me. In that moment, I realized that nothing would ever be the same. The seeds of discontent had been sown, and the dark night ahead would force me to confront everything I'd been denying for so long. Driving home that night, my thoughts were a jumble of exhaustion and uncertainty. The rain had started to fall, each drop echoing the steady beat of my tired heart. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles went white. It was then that fate dealt me a harsh blow, a minor car accident at a red light. The impact was jarring, a sudden collision of metal and pain that left my body aching and my mind reeling. I sat in the driver's seat, dazed and humiliated, feeling every bruise like a mark of my own fragility. After the accident, I made my way home slowly, my pace measured and my thoughts scattered. I was painfully aware of every ache in my body, a stark reminder that I wasn't invincible. Once inside my modest apartment, I tried to nurse my injuries with ice packs and over-the-counter painkillers, yet a deeper wound had been inflicted, a wound that wasn't physical, but emotional. As I settled into the solitude of my living room, the soft glow of my phone screen suddenly lit up the dark space. A family group chat notification appeared, a constant, unwelcome reminder of the familial ties that had always been more of a burden than a blessing. I hesitated before opening it, my heart pounding as I anticipated the familiar mix of pleas and condescension. But this time, something was different. Instead of the usual messages about helping each other out or just a quick transfer, I found a conversation that chilled me to the core. Fiona's text flashed on the screen, "Lydia's been our saving grace for too long." David quickly replied, "Yeah, she's our personal ATM. I mean, can you believe she still thinks it's her duty to cover everything?" And then came Judith's message, a voice filled with feigned concern. "We all know how much Lydia sacrifices. We just have to remind her of her place." I stared at the screen, my pulse racing. Each word was a dagger, revealing the true depth of my exploitation. I had always suspected that they saw me as nothing more than a source of endless funds, but to see it laid out so blatantly in text was unbearable. The shock of that moment paralyzed me. The physical pain from the accident was suddenly eclipsed by a deeper, more insidious hurt. I felt betrayed, abandoned by the very people I'd spent my life supporting. Tears blurred my vision as the reality sank in. My sacrifice had never been appreciated. It had been expected, taken for granted. I clutched my phone, as if holding it could somehow shield me from the truth. Every cruel word in that chat echoed in my mind, igniting a slow-burning fire of resentment that I had long suppressed. That night, as I lay in bed, the sounds of the rain mingled with the relentless replay of my family's callous words. My body was still recovering from the accident, but my heart was shattered. I couldn't shake the feeling that every bruise, every ache, had been a prelude to this betrayal. The familiar warmth of familial love had turned into a cold, calculated exploitation. In that dim light, I realized that I had been nothing more than a stepping stone for their ambitions, a pawn in a game that I had never agreed to play. Sleep eluded me as the hours dragged on, each minute stretching out with the weight of my newfound despair. I questioned everything, my choices, my worth, and the very foundation of the life I'd built for others. The pain in my body was matched only by the agony in my soul. In that lonely, tear-streaked night, I vowed silently that things had to change. I would no longer allow myself to be diminished by their selfishness. Even as my mind swirled with uncertainty and hurt, a flicker of defiance began to kindle deep inside me. The days that followed were a blur of work, recovery, and mounting anxiety. I trudged through each shift at the diner with a heavy heart. Each customer's order a stark reminder of the life I had been forced into. My body bore the scars of that accident, a constant, dull pain that pulsed with every beat of my heart. But worse than the physical injury was the emotional wound, raw and unhealed, inflicted by the knowledge of my family's contempt. At work, I sought solace in the mundane rhythm of tasks and routine chatter. I tried to drown out the memories of that night by focusing on the orders and the steady hum of the kitchen. But as fate would have it, the day arrived when my world was shattered yet again. In front of a room full of colleagues, I was publicly dismissed by a coworker I had once considered a friend, a trusted confidant who, in a moment of careless indifference, made a cutting remark about my work ethic. "You're just a cog in the machine, Lydia," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. The words stung like acid, and the murmurs of onlookers only deepened my humiliation. I felt exposed, insignificant, as though every effort I'd made was nothing more than a laughable attempt at survival. That public dismissal was like a confirmation of every doubt that had been gnawing at me. I felt worthless, as though I were destined to be nothing more than a disposable asset in a system that thrived on my sacrifice. The emotional isolation that had crept in over the years now felt like a chasm too vast to cross. With every whispered insult and every sidelong glance, my sense of self crumbled further. At home, the situation was no less dire. Fiona, David, and Judith, emboldened by my evident vulnerability, began to up their demands. One evening, as I scrolled through my phone with a numb detachment, a new message popped up in our group chat. It was from Fiona, her tone casual yet laced with urgency. "Lydia, the bills have doubled this month. The new electric bill, the rent, everything's up. We really need you right now." No sooner had I absorbed her words than David chimed in with a remark that stung sharply. "You're our lifeline, you know that, right? Without you, we'd be lost." Judith followed, her message replete with false pity and condescension. "Sweetheart, we understand it's a lot to ask, but family is family. We all count on you." I sat there, phone clutched in my shaking hands, each word a reminder of my exploitation. The rising costs, the relentless demands. It all coalesced into a suffocating pressure that threatened to crush me entirely. Every day, I was forced to live in a state of perpetual tension, never knowing when the next demand would come or how much more I would have to sacrifice. The weight of their expectations was like a boulder on my chest, and I could feel my spirit slowly being squeezed dry. In the quiet moments between work and the numbing routines of recovery, I found myself seething with anger and sorrow. How could they be so callous? How could the people who were supposed to love me see me only as a source of money, a tool to be exploited? The bitterness that had long been buried began to surface, fueled by every condescending message and every dismissive remark. I was trapped in a cycle of duty and abuse, a cycle that left me with a growing need to reclaim my dignity. My thoughts swirled with memories of better days, when I had believed in the unspoken bonds of family, when I thought love meant support and care. Now, every recollection was tainted by the sting of betrayal. I began to notice every little detail: the way Fiona's voice dripped with insincerity, the smug tone in David's texts, the calculated pity in Judith's words. Each message was a reminder that I was expendable, a commodity to be used until I was worn out and forgotten. Night after night, I lay awake, replaying the hurtful words in my mind like a broken record. The public humiliation at work, the car accident that had left me physically battered, and the merciless financial demands, they all converged into a single overpowering realization. I had been living a lie. I was not cherished, I was merely a resource, a safety net that my family took for granted. And with that realization came a burning resolve, a quiet determination that whispered of eventual rebellion, a promise that one day I would no longer allow them to control my life. It was during one of these sleepless nights, with tears drying on my cheeks and my heart pounding in a mixture of despair and determination, that I resolved. I would no longer be their victim. I might be physically fragile and emotionally scarred, but I was not weak. I began to see the truth laid bare before me, and in that clarity, I discovered a spark of defiance that promised a way out of the cycle of exploitation. In the weeks that followed, I found myself at a crossroads. Outwardly, I continued to fulfill my role as the ever-dependable Lydia, the one who would always answer the phone at odd hours, who would send money without a second thought. But inside, something was shifting. I decided to play along, feigning compliance even as my heart steeled itself against the onslaught of guilt and shame. I began to document every conversation, every message that revealed the callous intentions of my family. Every time Fiona bragged about my sacrifice or David dismissed my efforts as trivial, I saved the messages. Every condescending tone, every snide remark was recorded in my mind and in the digital archive I was secretly building. I continued to answer the calls, to send the funds when demanded, all while wearing a mask of quiet resignation. At family dinners, over the clatter of cutlery and forced small talk, I would smile and nod, concealing the turmoil that churned inside me. It was as if I had become an actor in a play that I no longer wanted to star in, but felt compelled to perform nonetheless. Each interaction was a delicate balance, a facade of obedience masking the growing inferno of my resolve. During the day, as I navigated the long hours at work and the dull hum of my daily routines, I began planning. I would analyze every text and every call, noting the exact moments of exploitation and the patterns in their behavior. I even started writing in a tattered notebook, a secret journal where I vented my frustrations and recorded my plans for a decisive break. Each entry was a mixture of bitter recollections and a cautious hope that someday I would be free from their relentless demands. One rainy afternoon, while reviewing a particularly damning group chat conversation on my phone, I realized that they had grown complacent. Their demands had become almost routine, an endless stream of excuses about rising costs and unexpected expenses. I knew that this routine would soon give me the perfect opportunity to act. I began to subtly alter my responses, allowing brief pauses before replying, a slight delay that made them wonder if I was truly as obedient as they believed. Every delay was a small victory, a crack in the armor of their exploitation. Inside, I was filled with a potent mixture of suppressed anger and quiet determination. I rehearsed scenarios in my head where I would confront them, where I would say all the things I'd kept locked away for so long. But for now, I continued the charade, knowing that the time for overt rebellion was not yet ripe. The documentation I was collecting became my silent protest, each saved message a testament to the abuse I had endured and a promise that I would one day turn the tables. As the days turned into weeks, my double life grew increasingly difficult to maintain. There were moments when the facade almost slipped, a phone call from Judith that made my hands tremble, a conversation with Fiona that left me seething with silent rage. Yet I held on. I forced a smile, even as every fiber of my being screamed for liberation. The turning point was nearing, and I knew that soon I would have to make my move. Until then, I would bide my time, quietly defiant, gathering strength from every slight and every injustice. It was in those moments of inner turmoil that I began to see my own worth more clearly. The realization that I was more than the sum of their demands, that my life was not meant to be spent in constant sacrifice, filled me with a cautious hope. I wasn't just Lydia, the exhausted provider. I was a woman with dreams, with dignity, with the power to reclaim her life. And with that newfound awareness, I set my mind on the one goal that would define my future: to confront the toxic cycle once and for all, and to do so on my own terms. The day the new payment was due dawned gray and oppressive, a mirror of the turmoil churning inside me. My phone buzzed incessantly with urgent messages and frantic calls from Fiona, David, and Judith, each one a desperate plea cloaked in feigned concern. They expected me to spring into action, to effortlessly transfer the funds that, in their eyes, were my birthright. I sat there, staring at the relentless notifications, my heart pounding with a mix of dread and resolve. This was it, the moment I had been preparing for, the time to shatter the carefully constructed facade and reveal the truth. I answered the calls as usual, my voice steady and controlled, even as every fiber of my being trembled with anticipation. When Judith's call finally came through, I listened to her rehearsed lines about rising bills and unexpected expenses, her voice dripping with that same insincere sweetness. "Lydia, dear, we're really in a jam here. The rent is going up again, and we just need you to help us out one more time," she pleaded, her tone laced with false sympathy. I could almost hear the practiced cadence of the other voices chiming in, Fiona's dismissive tone, David's casual, expectant remarks. And then something inside me snapped. In that long, silent pause between her words, I found the strength to speak up, to break the cycle of endless sacrifice. "Enough," I said, my voice cold and resolute. "I've heard every single one of you. I've seen your messages, your plans, your expectations, and I'm done being your safety net." The words, once released, reverberated in the quiet space around me like a gavel striking down on years of abuse. There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. Judith's voice faltered, a brief crack in her carefully honed mask of concern. "Lydia, what do you mean?" she stuttered, disbelief seeping into her tone. I didn't wait for her to recover. "I mean that I've been listening. I've been saving every message, every call. I know how you've treated me, as if I'm nothing more than a machine, a bank account you can draw from whenever you please. I'm not your ATM. I'm not your punching bag." My words, sharp and unyielding, cut through the air, leaving no room for excuses. Fiona's interjection was weak, her voice barely audible over the mounting chaos. "Lydia, please, we're your family, we need you." But her plea dissolved into a jumble of half-formed sentences as I continued, the dam of pent-up anger and sorrow finally breaking free. "No, I'm done with the manipulation, the entitlement, and the constant drain on my life. I will no longer support your selfish demands. From this moment on, you must learn to face the consequences of your actions without me." I could hear the disbelief, the shock, and the panic creeping into their voices. David's tone turned frantic, desperate attempts to guilt-trip me spilling out in a rushed stammer. "But Lydia, we've always been there for you. Don't you care?" I let the silence answer for me. Each second stretched as they tried to gather words, but I wasn't finished. "I care about you once when you were real," I said, my voice steady despite the tumult inside me. "But I'm not responsible for your mistakes, your overspending, or your selfish indulgences. You've taken advantage of my kindness for far too long, and I refuse to be complicit in your destruction any longer." With that, I ended the call, my heart pounding as I realized there was no turning back. The confrontation was complete. The fallout was immediate. In the hours that followed, my phone exploded with frantic messages, pleas for forgiveness, desperate calls for help, and bitter accusations that I was abandoning my family. I scrolled through the texts with a detached calm, my eyes scanning each word without a trace of regret. The tone was hysterical, full of shock and disbelief, as if my declaration had somehow undone the fabric of their entire existence. I sat alone in my small kitchen, the silence around me a stark contrast to the chaos on my screen. Every message was a reminder of the years of exploitation. Each desperate plea only deepened my resolve. I had finally reclaimed my power. The facade they had so carefully maintained was shattered, and the truth was out for everyone to see. That day marked the peak of my transformation. I was no longer the meek, exploited sister who had endured endless financial abuse. I was a woman reborn, fortified by the courage to stand up for herself. As the calls and messages continued, I felt an unexpected sense of liberation. The cold, hard truth had been revealed, and in that moment, I was finally free. In the aftermath of my confrontation, the house of cards that was my family began to collapse in real time. The fallout was not immediate, but the shock waves were unmistakable. Within hours, Fiona, David, and Judith's voices turned frantic. Calls that had once dripped with entitlement now burst with panic and guilt. I watched as the group chat exploded with desperate messages, each one more incoherent than the last, as they tried in vain to re-establish control over a situation that was rapidly spiraling out of their hands. Judith's earlier veneer of concern crumbled completely. Her messages, once carefully crafted to tug at my heartstrings, devolved into tearful pleas. "Lydia, please, don't leave us in this mess. We're all in this together," she texted repeatedly, her words punctuated by frantic punctuation marks. But no matter how many times she begged, my resolve remained unshaken. The realization that they had always seen me as a bank rather than a human being had set in stone my decision. Fiona's tone was laced with a desperation that was almost comical. She sent voice messages, pleading for forgiveness and promising to change, but the sincerity was absent. David, normally so smug and self-assured, became a jumble of contradictory messages, apologies mixed with frantic excuses about how we never meant to hurt you. Each desperate attempt to guilt-trip me fell flat, like echoes bouncing off an impenetrable wall of resolve. The more they scrambled to find a way to win me back, the more their true nature was exposed. Their frantic tone, the incoherent ramblings about family duty and being there for each other, were all too transparent. I sat back, my mind strangely calm amid the chaos, and let the desperation wash over me. Their manipulation, once so effective, now seemed as fragile as the lies they had built their lives upon. In the ensuing days, the effects of my decision rippled outward. News of my final refusal spread quickly among our relatives, and soon, even distant family members began to weigh in with their own criticisms of how I had let them down. The fallout wasn't confined to my immediate household. It became a catalyst for a deeper reckoning within our entire family circle. Conversations in hushed tones over the phone, secret meetings, and more group chats emerged, all focused on how to remedy the situation without me. I watched with detached satisfaction as the carefully curated image of our family disintegrated into chaos. The entitlement and condescension that had long defined our interactions were replaced by raw panic and regret. It was as if the walls they had built around themselves, fortified by my unending support, were crumbling under the weight of their own irresponsibility. Every call that went unanswered, every message left unread, reinforced the bitter truth. I was no longer at their disposal. In the quiet moments of those tumultuous days, I allowed myself to reflect on the journey that had brought me here. The pain of the car accident, the humiliation at work, the sting of every condescending message, they all converged into a moment of clarity. I realized that by standing up for myself, I had not only freed my own spirit, but I had also forced them to confront the consequences of their behavior. Even as they continued to plead, I maintained my silence. I knew that true change would only come when they were forced to face the music on their own. And so, with each passing day, the chaos became a backdrop to my quiet liberation, a final, bittersweet exodus from a life defined by exploitation. I no longer felt guilty for my decision. Instead, I embraced the certainty that I had finally reclaimed the one thing that truly mattered: my dignity. Now, as I sit in the stillness of my modest apartment, I can't help but reflect on the turbulent path that led me here. The scars, both physical and emotional, are a constant reminder of the years I endured as the family's unpaid servant. But in those scars, I also see the evidence of my strength. I have reclaimed not only my money, but also my self-worth, my identity. Walking away wasn't easy. There was a time I believed that family meant unconditional sacrifice. Now I know that self-respect means knowing when to say enough. I have chosen to rebuild my life on my own terms, free from manipulation, free from guilt, free from being treated as nothing more than a bank account. In this newfound silence, I find empowerment. I am no longer the broken, exhausted Lydia. I am a woman reborn, determined to forge a future that honors my true worth. I leave behind the chaos of entitlement and embrace the hopeful promise of independence. The road ahead may be uncertain, but for the first time, I am walking it with my head held high, unburdened, and truly free.